Okay, welcome back. We are today going to continue our discussion of concept and process, only today we're going to recap those two lectures from the point of view of design and designers. If you remember, the last video that I recorded was the process lecture. I'm sorry, it was quite a bit long. And before that, right before midterm, our last in-class lecture was on concept. I will be recording a video version of the concept lecture. That way you have that to as a resource to check. So like I said, this lecture is going to talk about design, but not just graphic designers. We'll also be talking about architects and even industrial designers. And I'm going to be talking about how the concepts of process and the concept of concept and concept development relate to the design field and how it's different from the way it relates in the fine art and studio art world. So first thing I want to talk about is sketchbooks and process books and how designers use them compared to studio artists. And one of the main differences is that designers tend to use their process books in a much more focused way, much more project focused. You have a problem, you have a client, and you're trying to solve that problem, and it's very much a process of repetition, of just coming up with lots and lots of ideas, 50 ideas, 100 ideas, until you're really confident that you've pushed yourself to the absolute edge of what your brain can come up with. And then you really start thinking about which ones are your best ideas and how to develop them. So these are examples from a young graphic designer, Claire Collon, who has a blog, and she posts a lot of images of her process work and of her process books. And I really like these process books and sketchbooks. I think her work with type is quite beautiful. But that's not the only approach to process books. Both Johnny Hartstaff and Tony Pritchard are graphic designers and graphic design faculty, where they teach graphic design at a university, and their approach to process books is quite different, much more open-ended, where they're just using their process books as a place to collect ideas, to collect images, both images that they create, but also found images, images from photographs. They use it as a place to just kind of randomly generate ideas for or not for a project. Certainly, especially in Johnny Hartstaff's case, there are places where he is working on a project, but there are also lots of pages where he's simply just generating interesting ideas that may or may not relate to a project later. Tony Pritchard's process books are even more open-ended, where he spends a lot of time working on these kind of open-ended abstract process works in paint, where he's just playing with different colors and different textures, and it's but it's still very much a part of his design process, in that, you know, when he's working on a project, he's still returning to these type sketches or works as a source material for visual ideas, a source material for ideas about color palettes and for ideas about textures and shapes. Another definition of a process book, or another type of process book that we might look at, are process books that are assigned process books, part of graphic design programs. In many graphic design programs, in either Graphic Design 1 or Graphic Design 2, the graphic design students are assigned a book where they have to lay out maybe somewhere 5 to 10 different projects, and then in those they're showing both their initial process work, their sketchbook work, their process book work where they're just sketching out ideas, to developing the ideas on, you know, in terms of in the material, usually digitally, all the way to the finished process, the finished product. And these become very useful materials, because sources for these students, because they kind of show you how you developed your idea, as well as what the end result was. So it's both highlighting your actual finished design, but it's also highlighting how you worked the problem. Here's another example of that, a little bit more open-ended than the previous two. So let's talk just briefly about design and the design process, and how that's different from the concept development process we talked about earlier in the process lecture. In the process lecture, we talked about a lot of different kind of concept development systems or ways, and I did kind of a schematic like these two up here on the top left, but they were much more complicated, and they were about how artists who are developing a whole body of work, how complicated sometimes one idea might lead to another idea, but oftentimes one idea might lead to 3 new ideas, and then those might lead to new ideas, and then they may all come back together. For a designer, especially graphic designers, this process is a lot more focused. It starts out at the beginning with a whole lot of exploration, a lot of trying ideas, and then it very quickly narrows to a set of ideas, down to one image, one idea, down to refinement. So there's a lot more focus to a graphic design kind of concept development process or ideation process. And here we have an example from the development of the new New York City Public Library logo, which is based on the old one, but then the new version of it. Little brief aside before I get into talking a little bit more about process development or ideation development in graphic design is another kind of assignment, usually more in graphic design graduate programs, is the assignment to develop kind of some sort of infographic or poster that represents you, the individual designer, your idea development process. And here are some more examples of idea development or ideation leading to one design. So, but graphic design is not the only place where idea development happens. It also happens in architecture. And in general, architecture is usually seen as a field where development and idea development is very, very client-driven and very, very focused, that it starts with like, well, how are we going to make this thing kind of approach. So it's very pragmatic and straightforward. But that is not always the case. There are some graphic designers, and most notably Frank Gehry, whose design process is extremely open-ended and open process, as much as almost any open-ended, painter, as open-ended as Terry Winter's paintings are, where he will start with these very loose type sketches, and then in the studio oftentimes he will go into the studio and him and his top 3 or top 4 other designers, they will just sit around a table and they're just going to play with paper, just folding and crumpling and bending and taping and cutting the paper into different shapes, and then looking at it and saying, well, what do you think of that? And then someone's like, well, I think we should add a piece here. And then they look at it and they're like, what do you think about that? Well, I like this change of plane. That's all they're doing, is just looking at it and thinking about what they like about the structure of this form, this abstract form, with no idea as to what it's going to be, what the client is, what the project is, what kind of building, what materials can be made out of. Once they come up with a model that they like, they send that to the people in the firm who work on the AutoCAD designs, and they come up with an AutoCAD structure, a digital version of it that just says this is what this thing looks like. And then later, when they have a client who has a specific project in mind, they might pull out some of those and say, what if we use this thing to solve that problem? And then, only then, when they've settled on that, do they then send it to the architects and the engineers who have to figure out how to make this thing a structure, how to make this thing stand up, how to bear weight. This is another Frank Gehry building. It's gorgeous. This is the Disney Symphony Hall, which is in Los Angeles, and I've actually been to this one. It's a pretty amazing building. So another thing that I think is kind of a connection between graphic design and process and concept is the way that graphic design is kind of similar in some ways, or some aspects of graphic design is similar to system art. That a lot of graphic design we think of as being very focused, very pragmatic, very client-driven. But there are aspects of graphic design, such as like the design of typefaces, that is very much like designing system art, because you're not designing a thing, you're designing a structure, a system that is to be used by someone else to make the thing, right? So that they are, when you design a typeface, you're not designing any poster or any packaging design, but you're designing a thing that, if used properly and if you designed it well, will help other people make great posters or great packaging design. I really love this periodic table of typefaces poster. This is actually available for purchase if you go to Squid Spot, so I think it's pretty cool. And so here's some more examples of type systems. And that's another thing